Hi everyone, and welcome to the opening video lecture for week 6. This week, we're further examining the topic of identity, particularly how the production of dehumanizing discourse relates genocide to other forms of violence. This continues a theme we've had since week 4, that genocide can emerge out of ostensibly normal conditions. More specifically, by the end of this opening video lecture, we'll see how the dehumanizing discourse produced by everyday relations of violence can result in genocide. That's the argument here, in any case. Reading one this week is another piece by American psychologist David Moshman, whose essay, Conceptions of Genocide and Perceptions of History, we covered back in Lesson 2b. Here in week 6, he situates genocide as an extreme result of the normal identity process. I'll explain what that means in a second. Next we have Australian social scientist Rowan Savage, who talks about the convergence between two discourses in the modern era. First, the ideal of a politically integrated and socially homogeneous nation-state, and second, the biological construction of race as an indelible marker of human difference that's been used to legitimize unjust systems of domination and destruction. Finally, reading 3 is by American anthropologist Nancy Shepard Hughes, who presents the idea of the genocide continuum in order to connect visible forms of violence, such as revolutions, wars, and massacres, with invisible forms of violence, such as infant mortality, starvation, and domestic abuse. Her thesis strongly emphasizes the normality of genocide. Reading 1 begins with the premise that genocide is inherently group-based. This is evident, of course, in the etymological root word genos. Now, we've already spent a lot of time debating over what types of groups should be included, and whether or not said groups should be objectively real or subjectively constructed. At the very least, we confidently say that group identity is at the heart of genocide. In the opening pages, Moshman also taps into a key theme in the class regarding the normalization of genocide, saying that genocide is an extreme result of the normal identity process. Again, this harkens back to an earlier discussion that was covered in Lesson 4a, for instance, when we talked about how Hannah Arendt's banality of evil thesis showed us that most perpetrators are neither perverted nor sadistic, but rather terrifyingly normal. Moshman goes on to present a 4-stage model of identity and genocide. In a nutshell, he says that dichotomization enables dehumanization, which in turn enables destruction, after which we maintain our moral identities through the processes of denial. By the end of reading 1, Moshman notes that these phases are substantially overlapping. They are not qualitatively distinct stages emerging in a stair-step progression. In other words, we should be careful not to overstate this model, or presume that there's a linear sequence here between these 4 phases. Now, I'll admit I have a bit of a problem with Moshman's decision to base his analysis on a phase model, or stages in a process. I understand that genocide is indeed a process, that's a given, but I don't necessarily think that synchronous operation going on here. Rather, I think genocide is a non-linear process. I can elaborate this more in the discussion forum, but, for example, I think that denial isn't simply a final phase. Rather, I think denial is endemic to the entire process. Our own dichotomized identity forces us to deny the full identity of others. To dehumanize is to deny. Denial thus takes place both before genocide and as it's happening, not just after. Besides, I don't think the value of Moshman's analysis concerns his discussion of the final phase, denial. Rather, I think what's most interesting in his reading is the first phase, dichotomization. Indeed, I think the value of Moshman's analysis is his etiological proposition. It's with this first phase that Moshman is making an etiological proposition. Remember, etiology is the study of causation. And this branch of science often searches for the root causes of certain phenomena, that is to say, the initiating factor in a causal chain leading to certain outcomes. The root cause of genocide, Moshman argues, is dichotomization, a term which literally means to split into two. As it's used here, dichotomization refers to a basic step in the social identification process. That is to say, the process in which people socially construct their multiple collective identities. This process is sometimes, although not always, constructed according to a basic us-them binary, whereby the in-group identity is based on a structured opposition to the out-group identity. Much like the related concept of ethnocentrism, which refers to the practice of judging another society by the values and standards of one's own society, the concept of identity dichotomization is very likely a universal phenomenon in anthropology. Moreover, it's not necessarily bad or evil, or at the very least, it doesn't invariably lead to genocide. Dichotomization is a necessary but insufficient condition, Moshman argues. In other words, genocide doesn't happen without some form of dichotomization, but still, more is needed to make it happen. In that sense, dichotomization leads to the next step in the process, dehumanization. Although our focus in Learning Objective 1 was on dichotomization as the primary step in the process of identification and genocide, Moshman in Reading 1 went on to highlight dehumanization as the next phase in the process. Across the corpus of historical and contemporary cases of genocide, members of targeted groups, i.e. the genus, have been variously portrayed as weeds, rats, vermin, dogs, cows, viruses, maggots, microbes, parasites, plague, pests, snakes, spiders, lice, locusts, cockroaches, cancer cells, and malignant tumors. Less biologically, they've also been portrayed and seen as heretics, heathens, infidels, barbarians, savages, subversive, terrorists. So on a symbolic level, these metaphors work to restrict the moral universe of obligation only to those within the in-group, as the others, from various out-groups, are deliberately omitted from any humane consideration and left vulnerable to exclusion or worse. Indeed, dehumanization can make genocide not only seem acceptable, but necessary. I'll come back to that in a second. So Reading 2 takes a closer look at dehumanization by putting the concept in historical context. The author, Rowan Savage, focuses on the convergence of two discourses around the mid to late 19th and early to mid 20th century, a period known as the Modern Era. There were two significant changes at this time. In the first place, there were very important changes in global politics. For centuries, if not millennia, the geopolitical map of the world had been based on empires, which tended to be large, ethnically diverse, and heterogeneous political entities. In the modern era, however, with the added nation-state, the political ordering of the geopolitical map was redesigned in accordance to this new ideal model of sovereignty. Unlike the heterogeneity of empires, nation-states were supposed to be, in some way, shape, or form, homogeneous, uniform, and streamlined. In this sense, the nation-state was fashioned in the image of a body politic, as if it were an organically integrated whole with clear boundaries between inside and outside. This dominant metaphor of political organization reflected the second major discourse covered in Reading 2, namely the post-Darwinist development of scientific racism. We'll talk more next week about eugenics and the national racial hygiene movement before the Holocaust. What's interesting is how the author contrasts the supposedly quote-unquote pre-modern era of Christendom, with its belief in the salvageability of the other, with the modern logic of scientific racism, and its belief in the immutable and unalterable laws of nature. Together, of the nation-state and scientific racism hardened the boundaries between the in-group and out-groups. The concept of biopolitics is at the intersection of these two discourses, where the image of the body politic became the reason of being for modern states. New developments in biological knowledge, such as the theory that disease is caused by microorganisms, were quickly appropriated as biopolitical metaphors, so that the other was constructed as a dangerous and subversive element that mustn't be tolerated. Such logic is based on commonplace knowledge. We're all familiar with the discursive or rhetorical parallels between disease and warfare. We regularly talk about killing germs or the war on cancer. This logic is instructive to understanding the perpetrator's mindset. Indeed, the role of physicians in various genocides, which the author discusses later on in the essay, suggests a key legitimizing function of this discourse, as genocide gets recoded or reinterpreted as a healthy act of self-defense, self-preservation, and purification. Moving on, in Reading 3, Shepard-Hughes offers a pretty radical etiological argument, which is that everyday violence makes genocide possible. Genocide emerges out of an evolutionary development of violence, she says, a continuum that grows out of a multiplicity of small, conveniently rationalized events embedded in our daily lives. So this is another argument for the normalization of genocide, as she's disturbing or problematizing the taken-for-granted assumption that genocide is entirely extraordinary. She instead points to the connections with other, more familiar forms of violence. This concept of the genocide continuum basically connects the state of war with the state of peace. A continuum, by the way, is a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from each other, although the extremes are quite distinct. So another way of distinguishing the opposite ends of this continuum between war and peace is to consider the difference between visible and invisible forms of violence. So on the visible side of the ledger are extensive, large-scale forms of political violence, such as revolutions, massacres, state repression, etc. Such violence is easily recognizable due to its overt physicality. But she reminds us that violence cannot be understood solely in terms of its physicality. Violence also includes assaults on the personhood, dignity, or sense of worth or value of the victim. This invisible violence includes things like infant mortality, infectious disease, sexual and gender-based violence, etc. It's this latter sphere where violence becomes sanctioned, even normalized. Shepard Hughes thus highlights the daily practices that seem to allow genocidal-like behaviors toward certain classes of disposable people. For example, she talks about her experiences in the slums of Brazil, where street children are often described as dirty vermin, so that unofficial policies of quote-unquote street cleaning, trash removal, fly swatting, pest removal are invoked in garnering broad-based public support for their extermination. Similarly, she talks about how so-called rubbish people are produced in nursing homes. In these circumstances, there's the capacity to reduce humans to non-persons, monsters, or things, which gives license to institutionalized forms of mass violence. In other words, the genocide continuum explains the willingness of ordinary people to enforce genocidal-like crimes against classes and types of people thought of as waste, as rubbish, as deficient in humanity, as better off dead, or even better off never having been born. Okay, so that's it for Lesson 5A. I'll spare you my regular script closing out the video lecture, and instead highlight the next steps with the conclusion of Lesson 6B. So anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.